All right, what's up, guys? Today is October 1st. It is a Thursday, and this is your social studies lesson for the day. Today, we are continuing the lesson that we were working on Monday and Tuesday, the Road to the Revolutionary War. So, to remind you, our unit question is, were the 13 colonies justified in their decision to declare war on Great Britain? And the question we're answering today for our lesson is, who was more responsible for the war between England and the colonies? We're looking at different sources and trying to determine who was more responsible for the war. Now, there's an opinion question, so I want you to form your own opinion as we look at the sources. So in class today, we chilled for 5 minutes. We do not have a circle warm-up because I want to make sure that we have enough time to get through all of our sources here. And so we're just going to jump right into the assignment. On Google Classroom, you'll need to go back to the assignment that was posted on Monday or Tuesday and open up your Google Doc. It's actually a Google Slides. It's titled The Road to the Revolutionary War. On Monday and Tuesday, we worked on sources A, B, and C. Today, we'll be doing D, E, and F, the summary, and the final report, which is a circa paragraph. So this is the assignment. This is what it looks like. We got through slide 10, so you should be on slide 11. We have 3 sources here. I will read through source D and part of source E, and then the second part of source E is a video that you guys can watch on your own. And then I will read through source F as well, and I'll read over the questions. And then I will explain the final summary and the final report. Okay, so here we go. Source D is the Townshend Acts. We talked about these in our notes. So here we go. I'm going to read these out loud to you. This is summarized from history.com. It says, the French and Indian War was very costly for Britain. Even though they won, it left them with very large debts. Compared to Great Britain's debts, the cost of the French and Indian War to the colonists had been slight. The colonists, who arguably enjoyed a higher standard of living at the time than their British counterparts, paid less than 1/20th the taxes of British citizens in England. The British government thought the colonists should help pay the costs for their protection. I want to put this into perspective for you. It says paid less than 1/20th the taxes of British citizens. So that basically means that in Britain, if they were paying $20 in tax, that means in the colonies they were paying less than $1 in tax. So that's how much Britain was taxed compared to the colonists. Okay, so Britain really saw these taxes as like fair because most of them have to pay it anyway. After the protests and repeal of the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts were passed to create a tax on all imported goods to the American colonies. But American colonists who had no representation in Parliament saw the act as an abuse of power. The British sent troops to America to enforce the unpopular new laws, further heightening tensions between the colonists and the British. All right, so that is our source D. The questions we're answering are number 1 and number 2. Number 1, the British claim that the colonists enjoy a higher standard of living than the British, and that they need to help pay for their protection. Do you agree that the colonists should pay their fair share? So basically, do you agree with the British, that the colonists should have to pay these taxes? Or do you disagree and you think that the colonists should not have to pay these taxes? Which side of this argument are you on? And explain why. Don't just say yes or no. Please explain why. Number 2, why were the colonists against the Townshend Acts in particular? Why did the colonists not like these taxes? And I'll give you a hint. It's the same reason they didn't like a lot of the other taxes. So think about that, because we've talked about this a couple times. All right, source E is on the Boston Massacre, which we will spend some time next week talking about as well. But here we go. It says, protests of the Townshend Acts continued. Boston became the epicenter of the protests. By 1769, more than 2,000 British troops had arrived in Boston to restore order. A large number, considering only about 16,000 people lived in Boston at the time. That would be equivalent to 75,000 troops coming to Louisville today. Skirmishes between Patriot colonists and British soldiers as well as colonists loyal to the British Crown, became increasingly common. To protest taxes, patriots often vandalized stores selling British goods and intimidated store merchants and their customers. Tensions between the colonists and British troops finally boiled over on March 5th, 1770, when British soldiers shot into an angry mob, killing 5 American colonists in an event known as the Boston Massacre. Little did the colonists or British soldiers know that across the ocean on the same day as the Boston Massacre, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Lord North, had asked Parliament to repeal the Townshend Acts. So the Townshend Acts are still going on. The colonists in Massachusetts are not happy about it, and they are protesting. In some ways that they're protesting, besides boycotting the goods, they're also vandalizing stores that are selling British goods, and they're intimidating the store merchants and the customers, scaring people away from the stores, scaring people from coming to work in the first place. So these are just some of the things that they were doing to protest. So we have the British soldiers that are in Boston that are trying to keep order, and we have the colonists that are protesting and that are basically sometimes inciting violence, trying to intimidate people, and vandalizing stores. And so these two groups kept clashing, and so a lot of people argue that the Boston Massacre, or at least an event like this, was inevitable, that it was going to happen eventually. And so eventually it does. Then you go to this next slide. I want you to watch this short video. It's a little, basically a graphic novel or cartoon that explains what happened. And then I want you to go to the next slide and answer the questions. So number 1, why did the British send the troops to Boston in the first place? And why did the Bostonians not want the British troops there? Why were they mad about the troops being there? Okay. Number 2, was it appropriate for the British troops to fire on the citizens of Boston? So if that's an opinion question. I want to know, like, basically, did the British troops have the right to fire on these people? Do you think they were defending themselves, or do you think that they could have done something else? Okay. And number 2, what do you think happens next? Just give me a prediction as to what happens in the following days of the event. Okay. Moving on to Source F. Source F is common sense. We had a lesson on Wednesday about this. It was a little video. So you should know the basics of this, but here we go. Common Sense was written by Thomas Paine, published January 10th, 1776. In early 1776, Common Sense by Thomas Paine was spread around all 13 colonies like wildfires. It was read in taverns and distributed as pamphlets. It laid out clear reasoning for colonial independence from Britain. Common Sense by Thomas Paine was popular because of the simple language it used. It allowed people from all walks of life to be able to read and understand Paine's arguments. Okay, so Thomas Paine wrote his pamphlet, Common Sense, in a way that everyone could understand. This wasn't the case for a lot of writing at this time. A lot of writing was released, and it was for people who were educated. It was for people who had gone to college or were fortunate enough to have a good education. And this was not the case with Common Sense. Thomas Paine wrote this for the common man. It would be like today, it would be like a politician posting things on social media for everyone. You know, it's not this complex language. It's language that everybody can understand and agree with and parse through, basically. Continuing Source F, these are just some excerpts. Now, this language is not particularly friendly to us now because they talk differently back then. So this might sound a little complex and complicated, but I'll try to break it down as best I can here. So the excerpts say, it is not in the power of Britain to do this continent justice. The business of it will soon be too weighty and intricate or complicated to be managed with any tolerable degree of convenience by a power so distant from us and so very ignorant of us. To be always running 3,000 or 4,000 miles with a tale or a petition, waiting 4 or 5 months for an answer, which when obtained requires 5 or 6 more to explain it in, will in a few years be looked upon as folly and childishness. There was a time when it was proper, and there is a proper time for it to cease. So in this excerpt, Thomas Paine is basically saying Look, the way that the colonies need to be managed it's soon going to be too complicated it's going to be too complicated for Britain to be able to manage us with any degree of convenience. Basically saying, like, it's going to be too difficult for them to manage us. We're too far away, and we're too large. Things over here are becoming too complicated, and they are not going to be able to manage us properly. Not because that they're unintelligent, but because they're so far away. It doesn't make sense. If we need problems solved now, it does not make sense for a government so far away to manage us. He says it's going to take 4 or 5 months for our answers and for our problems to reach them, and then it's going to take more time for them to determine what to do to solve the problem, and then they have to travel back and tell us what their solution is. And it just doesn't make sense to continue this. He says there was a time when it was proper. Basically, there was a time when this worked, but at this point, it does not work anymore. Things have become too complicated in the colonies, and it's not going to work. Okay. And continuing to our excerpt, it says, small islands not capable of protecting themselves are the proper objects for kingdoms to take under their care. But there is something very absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. So he's basically saying it would make sense if the colonies were like a small island. If Great Britain was managing us and we were a small island, that makes sense. We need protection because we are small, and Britain is able to provide that protection. In this situation, the colonies are actually larger than the original country, much larger than Great Britain at this point, actually. And so he's basically saying it doesn't make any sense for that island in Europe to manage over this whole continent that is currently larger than Great Britain and is only going to grow in size. It doesn't make sense. So these are just a couple excerpts from Common Sense. This is not all of it. There's a lot more to it, but these are just little pieces that I pulled out of it. Okay. So the questions we're answering, number 1, it says, based on the excerpt, what is Thomas Paine's position on Great Britain ruling over the colonies? Summarize his reasoning. So I recommend flipping back in this video, going over what I said, because I broke down basically what he was saying. And number 2, it says, if Thomas Paine had all of the technology of today, how might he have quickly spread his argument to the colonists? Because, like I said, Common Sense, the reason it got so popular is because he communicated it in common language to the common people. So if this happened now, if someone now were to publish something like Common Sense, how would they spread their argument? How would they communicate it to us? What platforms would they use? Okay. So that is our last question for source F. When you're finished with these, you move on to the final summary. This should look really similar to the final summary we did for our history mystery lesson, because it's basically the same thing. But the question is a little different. So it says, for each source, summarize in one sentence how the event helped to lead to the American Revolution. So if we take Common Sense, how did source F help lead to the American Revolution? What happened, or what was its significance that eventually led to the revolution, right? And so we know from our notes that Common Sense basically popularized the idea of independence. It started people thinking about independence rather than just resolving problems with Great Britain. A lot of people, because of Common Sense, a lot of people started to consider that independence was an actual option. So that is a summary for source F, right? So I want you to do that same thing for all of the sources that we looked at, okay? And then the final slide, it says, you will write a circa paragraph to answer the essential question. Who was more responsible for the war between England and the colonies? Okay, so I want you to make sure that you follow all of these steps. Make sure you have all of these things included into your circa paragraph. Type it into this little post-it note. If you double-click the post-it note, it'll let you type. So your claim for this should be the colonists were more responsible for the war, or the English were more responsible for the war. And then the rest of the paragraph will be you proving your claim, citing evidence from the sources, giving me reasoning, explaining your evidence. I want you to have a counter argument in there that explains the other side. And finally, make sure your audience is good. Make sure you have proper punctuation and grammar. Make sure you're not using slang or abbreviating. And that's what I'm looking for here. This is going to be a big part of your grade, so please take your time, and I will see you guys next week. Have a good weekend, and don't forget to be awesome. Thank you.